Fractal Era 2 ITX case is in for review today. It has a lot of mechanical features. So while that top panel pops off like kind of a lever, the back has a dust filter that serves as a locking mechanism. So this comes out, and when it does, it releases the outer shell, which comes off in a single piece. And then the top has these latches on either side. So this mechanism will release the radiator mount at the top, which we've got a radiator in there right now, but when it comes out, it gives you pretty full access to the whole case. And then internally, there is a movable spine, let's do it this way, where this whole motherboard tray and spine relocates with 4 screws to shift left and right, which allows adjustment for the CPU and the GPU cooler clearance depending on the build. There's also a single screw that controls a rail-mounted dual SSD cage, but the case also does some weird things and has some problems. For one, our wood panel is cracked. This is primarily concerning because it's a point that Fractal really pushed when it unveiled the case. When we spoke with Fractal at Computex, they specifically called attention to this metal inner frame, which is supposed to help reinforce the wood, prevent warping or bowing, such as misaligning due to humidity or just exposure to temperature changes as it travels. This is supposed to prevent the cracking, but on ours, unfortunately, it wasn't enough. Now, the secondary kind of just weird thing from a configuration standpoint is actually on the power supply side. So the power supply ends up with the exhaust down here, and it's in direct conflict with the bottom intake fan right here. So if the power supply fan is active, it's gonna end up pushing air through the panel, down into the intake fan, which is immediately below it, which is pushing air back up. This is another thing that we made another one of our 3D airflow animations for to help explain the configuration that Fractal created, where the power supply fan is fighting the intake fans. We'll talk about this more later. So it's a very mechanically complex case. It's overall actually something we really like. You'll see at the end of the whole review process. This is something that we can end up recommending for the most part, and that the most part comes down to price. So it is $200, and we're gonna try and identify where that money's going by reviewing the build quality and the thermal performance and acoustics of the Fractal Era 2. Before that, this video is brought to you by Squarespace, and visiting squarespace.com/gamersnexus will give you 10% off your first purchase with them. We've built a number of our own websites with Squarespace, where we list catastrophic PC hardware failures to inform subscribers of those failures. We also built our store website with Squarespace using its built-in e-commerce tools, and of course, we built a website for our CEO Snowflake because she demanded our audience know who really runs the show. Get to the core of your idea and spend less time on web design by signing up at squarespace.com/gamersnexus or click the link below. Let's go over the basics and some of the competition first. So colors, it comes in this blue, a black, and a silver. One of the things we noticed on the blue in terms of finer attention to detail was it has that almost car-like finish where there's that metallic speckle in it, and actually looks pretty good on this one. These are ITX sandwich style cases. The case has 2 pre-installed fans in the bottom for intake, room for a 240 or 280 liquid cooler in the top, and a continuing trend of higher cost ITX cases. A good portion of that cost is probably tied up in these 2 things, which is a relatively thick, as you can see, aluminum panel and then the walnut wood on top. The side panels have ventilation via a hole pattern that ranges from sparse to useless and artsy, mixing that artistic approach with at least trying to hit the basic requirements of cooling. These holes are a good indicator that Fractal is looks first on this case, and we'll talk thermals later in the video. The original Era ITX predecessor is a smaller case with a similar look, but also one which Fractal has openly told reviewers it felt it had underperformed on. We never reviewed that one. The company is trying to fix its shortcomings with the Era 2 though. In terms of competition, we'll start with Fractal's own case, which is the Terra. We reviewed this one previously. This is another ITX case. It's much smaller in some dimensions, and it shares a few things in common with the Era 2. One of them being the movable spine, which again allows for adjustment for GPU cooler size and CPU cooler size, but also the motherboard tray and the power supply location, the video card location. It's actually spatially all in about the same places as in the new Era 2, where, is it secure? Gambling, yes, it is secure. Where you can see positionally the power supply is in the same spot, relatively speaking, motherboard's in the same spot, left side from my perspective, and then the video card in the same spot on the other side. So they share that in common, but the power supply is rotated 180 degrees on the Era 2 versus the Terra. Terra and Era. Interesting. A new conspiracy theory is that it saves cost on the shipping boxes. They just They just add a letter. It's very economical from Fractal. Now, some of the reasons for the power supply rotation is that it orients the cables facing up, which gives you a lot better ease of access and cable management capability. And then again, the exhaust we'll come back to later. Other than its own Terra though, competition to the Fractal Era 2 would include some of these cases. First, the $150 Lian Li A3-mATX. This is a smaller, more rectangular, simpler case. It has no extra fans, and it still supports a 240 liquid cooler. A much larger and cheaper comparison would be the A3-mATX from Lian Li and Dan cases. We recently reviewed that one, but it exists in a totally different market segment. We did like the case though. We also recently reviewed Fractal's Mood, but we would recommend against that case. Its thermal performance was overall poor, and some of its compatibility choices were odd, as we discussed in that review. The M1EVO is another relatively expensive, specialized ITX case you could look at. That one allows a lot of flexibility. It's less railroaded, but it also has some problems as a result. And you can let us know what other cases you're interested in ITX, and we can consider them for future reviews. Getting into the dimensions and compatibility, the Era 2 is 365 millimeters long, 165 millimeters wide, and 315 millimeters tall, which calculates to a 19-liter volume and is nearly spot on with Fractal's own measurements. So if you're keeping track of our ITX case reviews at home, you can add one more tally to the side of the column that says, didn't lie on the spec sheet. So excellent job, Fractal. You get our prestige and esteemed did not lie on the spec sheet award. The movable spine has a major impact on internal fitment and can be set to 3 predetermined stepped positions. This is a big change from the stepless nature of the Terra's spine adjustment. Position 1 gives the most CPU side clearance and fits up to 70 millimeter tall coolers, while reducing GPU side clearance to 48 millimeters, or just 2.4 slots of available thickness. Position 3 changes those values to 55 millimeters for the CPU side and 63 millimeters, or if you want to use it, 3.1 slots for the GPU. Maximum GPU height is 137 millimeters regardless of spine position, but you'll want to be aware of the cable bend as well. Fractal recommends a max GPU backplate thickness of 4 millimeters. It's pretty uncommon to be that large. And bear in mind that larger GPUs will restrict air movement within that side of the case, and power cable management can become problematic with larger cards. So as always, just because it fits doesn't mean it is a good fit. Now for the fitment of specific video cards, this next segment is dedicated to Greg. Greg wrote a comment last time and said, we think AMD GPUs, which are objectively and almost universally smaller than NVIDIA GPUs, are a myth. Now, we made no statements about the quality of either of the brands. We just chose the one that made the big cards and used that as fitment. So, Greg, here's to you. Let's take a walk over to storage. Here we have the AMD side. Now we're gonna run through the fitment. So, fits, 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 fits. Doesn't fit, doesn't fit, doesn't fit. And just in case there's any Gregs who want to talk about Intel next time, we are prepared for you. Do your worst. Now, as another point of reference, the RTX 4080 Founders Edition fits, but it'll have its flow-through cooler heavily limited due to having only 11 millimeters of clearance behind the card in spine position 3. So once again, we're back to the sort of, it fits, but it is not necessarily a good choice. For cooling, the top bracket can hold 280 millimeter radiators and fan combos up to 52 millimeters thick. 240 millimeter liquid coolers can be slightly thicker depending on exact placement, but will quickly encroach on power cables and their own tubes. Both SFX and SFX-L power supplies are supported. Space for cables is greatly hampered by SFX-L, so we'd favor standard SFX instead. Internal driving support is pretty good for the size of the case. There's 4 2.5-inch mounts in total, 2 in the rail mount drive cage, blocking off a large portion of the intake fan below it, and 2 on the spine behind the power supply, though they're only usable with the spine in positions 1 and 2 and would be detrimental to flow-through GPUs. 3.5-inch drives are not natively supported in the case. All right, so time to run through some positives and negatives for the Era 2. We'll start with the positives on this one. First of all, overall accessibility is excellent in this case. The thing that we like the most, we're having this top mount radiator tray, which radiator trays are not new, but doing it the way that Fractal has is excellent. It is not only a structural component to hold the chassis sort of rigid when it's latched in, but the way it removes screwlessly and is still secure, we think is well done. Removing that is what gives that accessibility, though, where you can access the whole case pretty easily. And also, despite sort of some of the potential downsides, although not materialized ones for the power supply placement, we did like that orienting it this way, in the very least, gives a huge amount of access up here. And although you can manage the cables in something like the Terra, it requires a lot more time, maybe a little bit of skill for people who haven't done much PC building before. So we did think that came out well also. We also thought that the Era 2 does the build process right. It's relatively straightforward by ITX standards, and that makes it a more approachable ITX case than some of its competitors. The GPU side of the case is essentially wide open, and a cutout at the front helps with installation of the longest supported GPUs. You're able to angle the far end of the card through the hole first and then move into the PCIe slot positioning. Cable management is also excellent overall and is one of the most difficult things for an ITX case to accommodate successfully. There are tie-down points and small channels for cables everywhere, like around and in between the bottom fans. Even the most GPU-biased spine position, 3, would have you ending up with just enough space around the edge of the motherboard to get the job done tidily for cable management. The manual is also well made and offers actually helpful cable management tips. So overall, for the positives, Fractal's attention to detail on the Era 2 is great, and they were able to make the case easy to use despite its complexity by working through thoughtful design and engineering. Had a number of other smaller detail finishes we liked as well. So just to list those really quickly, the tapered plastic rails at the front and rear ensure that the sliding of the shell on and off is smooth. There's a slight inward angle along the bottom interior edges to help keep cables tucked in. Flared leading edges on the rail interface for the drive cage and the power supply bracket are well done in small touches. The opening at the front of the internal chassis to assist with long GPU installation is rounded over to be completely smooth. There's a small strip of fabric glued to the top edge of the front I/O to keep the aluminum from rubbing, and the dust filter doubles as a locking mechanism, as we showed earlier, which causes 2 spring-loaded plastic lugs at the front to pivot into place. And one last one, there's a bowed down filter at the bottom, which matches the bowing of the underside of the case, which Fractal claims, at least, gives better access to air. Moving on to the negatives, one of the only difficult aspects with building in the Era 2 was access to the motherboard top edge, which ends up at the bottom edge in this configuration, just because they've changed the orientation of the board. So it limits the access to cables like EPS 12 volt, some of the fan headers. We'd recommend just pre-connecting these to make it a little easier on yourself, unless you're okay with digging around with a plastic spudger to try and force things into place. Now back to that wood panel. So this is another negative. Our sample has a cracked panel, and it's in one place between the edge and the interior slats. We don't know at what stage the wood cracked, possibly at the factory, maybe in storage and shipping, maybe from crossing climates, humidity change, temperature gradient. Either way, wood is a relatively sensitive material, and this makes us concerned about the durability of the part, because Fractal specifically told us that it took steps to reinforce this panel. The company emphasized in its early meetings with us this year that it was reinforcing the panel with metal to prevent cracking in a way that made it sound like they were taking shots at competition. But now we wonder if it was actually because of their own experiences. Using 2 separate pieces of wood might have avoided this, despite creating a seam that would be a little more unsightly. This isn't extremely noticeable, but it is disappointing. So for this panel, that made us wonder if Fractal, you can see they've got the single support crossbar here. You know, if we press that together, the crack sort of disappears back into it. And when I was looking at this, it almost looks like the panel sort of very slightly pushed itself outward, maybe just as it cured or ages. I don't know. I'm not a wood expert, but that's what it looks like is happening. And what we're wondering is if they maybe say get rid of that one and do 2 crossbars, or find another place to run a support. It might help kind of pull those sides horizontally together so that they don't try to escape from each other and cause that crack. But ultimately, we're not sure what caused the crack to begin with. We just know that it's cracked. Anyway, also in the realm of build quality, one of the side panels on our sample is Tesla-like in that it doesn't line up perfectly with the panels around it, resulting in a visible jump from one to the other. These are both QC issues at the core and are things that Fractal should definitely be on the lookout for with a $200 case. A final slight annoyance is the fact that the shell has a crossbar at the bottom of the rear I/O area, meaning that you have to remove all of the cables before you can slide the shell on or off. Fractal could have built this in a way where it'd be easier to get into the case for maintenance without that bar, though this may have been a sacrifice intentionally for rigidity. For the potential airflow downside, we'll turn now to our animation. As we mentioned before, the power supply's exhaust side faces the intake fan. The case orients the power supply for the easiest cable management at the cost of potential airflow conflict between the PSU exhaust and the bottom intake. Most modern power supplies stop spinning the fans when the load isn't sufficient. So at idle, this should actually work pretty well. The bottom fan will force air into the power supply sort of backwards, allowing it to flow past the power supply's exhaust vent, through the passive fan, and out the traditional bottom of the power supply. Although in this situation, it's the side of the power supply. That air will then exit through the perforations in the side of the chassis. That much is good. When the power supply fan becomes active, it'll suddenly directly fight the force-fed air from bottom intake, and it's likely that bottom intake will overpower the power supply fan. There's enough of a gap where it won't cause major problems, as opposed to a directly attached opposing fan, but this could still be suboptimal for some configurations. It's going to be highly PSU dependent. It's not something we think is a critical issue, but it is one that was a little bit odd. Ultimately, ITX cases are about trade-offs. Fractal definitely consciously made that decision when they made the trade-off. So if we think through it, the main reasons that they might have done this would be one, just again, the cable management up here. They can't really orient this to be flat against the front, so they've got to go this direction with it. Cable management's better this way. If you were to flip it, the other situation is that the bottom intake fan is now just blowing into potentially a solid wall, depending on how they orient it. The cables are going to be closer to that fan. They're more likely to droop into it. And so ultimately, we think, given the way they want the power supply to be situated, this is probably one of the better solutions. Doing it like the Terra, in this case, where it's going to include that bottom fan, might just cause more problems for people than necessary. And despite being suboptimal for the power supply, we didn't see any reason thermally that it's going to cause major problems for a power supply, even though it's kind of in conflict. Now, a place where it would cause major problems is when the intake is directly against the exhaust. We saw this in PS5 testing previously, where we bought some really cheap coolers that you strap to the back of the PS5 and they blow in opposing directions. That actually slightly can increase the temperature, but there's enough of a gap where the air will disperse. It's just different. Now we're going to jump into thermal testing. So for ITX testing, as we've explained in the past, it's different than our ATX case testing methodology. For ATX, we go for comparisons and head-to-head between the ATX cases. For ITX, we focus instead on doing multiple configurations of the case so that you get a fuller picture of any individual case. And that's because ITX is so specific to the whole build, kind of leans on other parts of the build. And so it's difficult to standardize that because you're always going to be making a sacrifice in one case, but not another. It's not as fair head-to-head in some situations, and it's just a lot more judgment calls that are difficult to fully objectively lock in without making a bunch of subjective decisions. So we focus our testing on different configurations, which we'll go through here. And for the Era 2, all the testing was performed with locked power and frequency on the CPU and the GPU. As usual, we lock the GPU fan speeds. And then for everything else, for this one, we had the liquid cooler, the 240 CLC at 100% pump and fan speed, and the case fans at 100% unless otherwise listed anywhere. And we treated spine position 1 as what we're calling the default position, since it's the one intended for this size of GPU specifically. So let's get into the thermals. We'll start with CPU thermals. These are less interesting than the GPU and the VRM and memory thermals we'll look at in a moment. All the results were in a narrow band of only 2.1 degrees Celsius for the CPU here. The stock result has a slight lead, with the P-cores at a steady state average of roughly 45 degrees Celsius over ambient. Removing the top panel didn't result in any meaningful thermal change, showing us that despite appearances, it actually isn't restrictive to flow, at least not in this configuration. Setting the spine to position 3 hurt CPU thermals slightly, but not significantly. We were curious if the holes on the side panels actually impacted anything in a big way, so we covered them with tape, and the answer for CPU thermals is no, not really, since it's tied with the position 3 result. The biggest impact was from populating and installing the lower drive cage, resulting in 46.8 degrees over ambient on the P-cores. If you have just a single SATA SSD, we would recommend mounting it to the forwardmost spine mount behind the power supply to avoid this blockage, although a lot of people are on NVMe these days. Generally speaking, the two sets of fans at full speed are somewhat brute forcing the situation, but the noise levels aren't actually that high or unpleasant in this test setup. in our hemi-anechoic chamber due to the fan's middling 2000 RPM maximum. GPU thermals are next and post a wider range. Results are also consistent here. They're well within operating ranges for the GPU temperature itself. The stock results have the GPU die at 50 degrees Celsius over ambient at steady state, with roughly 68 degrees Celsius hotspot and 43 on the VRAM. Removing the top, again, has no appreciable effect. The spine position 3 result isn't meaningfully outside of variance, but suggests that keeping the GPU's intake fans closer to the side panel is helpful. Installing the drive cage raises the temperature of the core by about 2 degrees Celsius, but could be further exaggerated by larger GPUs that need all the airflow help they can get. The more of this volume you fill with a card, the more that's going to matter. Blocking the side ventilation and moving the spine to position 3 to allow the GPU the best access to internal air shows us that the holes actually do help as the temperature climbed. For VRM and RAM, we see some actually pretty big scaling differences in some of these configurations. Everything is still kept well within check by the fan blasting air at the top edge of the motherboard, but there's still a bigger range. The stock position 1 result is the best at just 20 degrees Celsius over ambient. Moving the spine to position 3 gave us the worst result. This makes sense considering the proportion of intake air is reduced on the CPU side of the case when moving from 1 to 3. Interestingly, blocking the side panel actually lowered VRM temperature by a couple degrees. We suspect this is because taking away those exit routes forces the intake air in that region to flow only over the motherboard. All right, so the Fractal Era 2, we think it has a great combination of features, ease of use, and performance. Overall, this is a much better and more sort of competent showing collectively than Fractal's Mood case that it released recently. We have a separate video about that one. The single largest downside for the Era 2 is maybe the price. At $200, it's not crazy for boutique ITX, and by not crazy, I mean that's what a lot of them cost. It is still expensive, though, in sort of an objective sense. And that's just, I don't know. Unfortunately, it's part of the sort of high-end boutique ITX world. But that is one of the biggest downsides. It's pretty steep for mass market. We think a lot of that cost is in the material. So aluminum is not particularly cheap. The walnut is probably not particularly cheap either, especially with their sourcing solutions that they do. And so that's contributing to it. Now, ATX cases at this price can be really impressive. They inherently have more flexibility and they cost more to ship. But as always, ITX is about wanting the form factor. So if you already want ITX, then ATX isn't even on the list anyway. In terms of construction, we think the Era 2 displays a mastery of stamped steel as a medium. There are numerous features and fine detail touches all over the stamped parts that indicate use of complex, multi-step tooling, and nothing is left sharp. Fractal is reaching an impressive level of tooling engineering maturity as it continues to refine its cases. The exterior aluminum shell and the walnut top panel come off as the weakest parts in that regard for ours. Our sample has both the crack in the wood and a misaligned side panel. This shows possible execution issues despite strong fundamentals. Speaking of the shell, Fractal could use this as an opportunity to make visually and functionally distinct versions of the case by just making new exteriors. That opened up the avenue to do more colorways or seasonal colors going forward. We were most impressed by the mechanical features and the smart implementation of them. The top radiator mount is executed well. The locking action with the dust filter is clever. The rail system with a single screw for power supply and SSD brackets also worked well. And the movable spine to fine-tune part fitment is improving with iterations. Thermals are good all around, despite strange power supply orientation. The Era 2 sits at the opposite end of the spectrum from how tedious and clunky the NCASE M1EVO is. The only thing going for the M1EVO in this comparison, we think, is its extreme versatility and its ability to fit the largest GPUs and also just how customizable it is, making it not only more versatile, but also the less rails-bound solution. But it is one we think is a lot less refined than the Era 2. The versatility has its benefits, they're just for a different kind of build. For the money, we think the Era 2 makes the $180 Terra look a little less appealing on paper, since the $20 gets you 2 fans and much expanded capability in cooling and drive mounts. That said, the Terra is smaller, it has a unique look, and its own mechanical complexities that might just be more to some people's liking. The two cases are different enough, especially in size, that anyone who wants a Terra specifically may find the Era 2 non-viable. But if you think either one could work and you're just on the fence, we would favor the Era 2 at this point between them. But it's obviously not the only ITX case in the market. There's a lot of ITX cases. We're still catching up on everything that's out there, but we've worked on a good amount of them over the past year. And something that you might consider looking at if you're also interested in this form factor might be the A4H2O. It's similar in size in some ways. It's a totally different case. It's a lot less looks focused. It's very plain. It's very railroaded in that there's kind of one way to build it. But it's cheaper. And so that's something you can consider. And the build quality is overall good for the A4H2 as well. We liked that one. The A3-mATX, while we're on that topic, is also an excellent case for a relatively low price by modern standards, $70 to $85, depending on the variant you get, but it's much larger. So it's kind of a different category of case. It's micro ATX, not ITX, and different style, not directly comparable, but we think you should be aware of it. If you're kind of open to just any small-ish case, that might be one worth putting on the radar, especially if you are trying to build something a little cheaper. Now, other ITX cases we've looked at recently have been totally different in style. So like the sort of tower format Cooler Master one that we looked at. But we've got all that in the playlist on the channel if you want to check out our case reviews to learn more about these. And overall, we think the Era 2 is well executed. It is a great recovery from what we thought was a fumble with the Fractal Mood. And you can watch that review if you want to learn about that one. This is a far better sort of showing from Fractal. So that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more. If you want to support this type of in-depth testing and independent reviews, you can go to store.gamersnexus.net to grab something like the mod mat that's on the table in front of me for your PC building projects. Or you can go to patreon.com/gamersnexus where you can just support us directly for a few bucks a month. Thanks for watching. We'll see you all next time.